Hello again. My name is Alex, and I'm working as Festivals Distribution and Project Coordinator at SDI. And I am here with SDI Director Noe Mendelle to talk about Bridging the Gap in kind of more broad terms and talk about the history. It's 19th anniversary this year. This edition is its 19th edition, so we have a lot to talk about and a lot to discover about this program and about the kind of aims and objectives with it, but also some of the changes and challenges and whatever other things we might uncover in this conversation. So because this is such a small group, then we can have an open conversation. And if you have any questions, just feel free to unmute and ask directly, or you can always post in the chat box here. So yeah, without further ado, I would just like to start by asking Noe to tell us the story of Bridging the Gap and how and why it began, and how and why it continues.
Thanks, Alex. Well, maybe rather than just kind of going straight into bridging the gap, I'm just going to talk a little bit about myself. I'm sorry. But just kind of, to put it in the context, I became a filmmaker I was based in Yorkshire, and I was part of the setting up of Channel 4, the workshop movement, as it was called. When Channel 4 started, they had a remit where they had to work with filmmakers who basically did not belong to the industry, would not belong to the trade union. In those days, in order to work as a filmmaker, you didn't have that many choice. I mean, basically, it was for television and it was mainly for BBC. There were only two ways of getting jobs at the BBC. You either came through Cambridge University for some reason, or you had to go to the National Film School as a young filmmaker. And either way, basically, you would get your union ticket, which will allow you then to be employed as a filmmaker by the BBC or another broadcaster. Now, I can't even begin to tell you how impossible it was to get that union ticket if you didn't go that way. The National Film School only took 5 people a year into the school, and they certainly didn't favor women in those days. So you can be sure that it was even harder I would say, as a woman, as anyone who did not fit basically the BBC stereotype Cambridge kind of approach. So without that union ticket, no one could become a filmmaker at any level at all. So Channel 4 coming along actually broke that union rule. And it's a little bit of an irony because Channel 4 was set up at the height of Margaret Thatcher, who was probably one of the most right-wing governments that UK had. And it was really odd that on one hand, a group of people who wanted to create a channel of television where communities were allowed in, where different voices, where diversity was represented, were sitting at the same table as right-wing conservative ministers who basically their interest was to break the trade union. Our interest wasn't so much to break the trade union, but our interest was to get a TV channel where we could possibly have the diversity and a better representation of UK. So it was a very strange alliance. Definitely, it was jumping into bed, kind of, with your enemy from kind of, from both sides. But it happened. Channel 4 happened. And Channel 4 had an amazing kind of remit at the time. And part of it was very much helping filmmaking communities, collectives to develop around UK. So altogether, I think we had about 25 collectives around UK, and we used to call that workshops. So I was part of one of them in Sheffield, and and my experience as a filmmaker very much kind of developed there, being kind of a filmmaker. As a feminist, as a socialist, kind of fighting kind of for equality, and trying to make sure that representing the community was a fair way for people to see themselves kind of on television. So at the time, as a woman, it was really, really difficult to get trained and and you didn't have any media courses. It makes me sound like I'm really old. Promise you, I'm not that old. But it just we didn't have anything. I mean, no media courses. And therefore, you relied on the goodwill of especially a few guys to teach you how to make films. And just kind of, as a parenthesis, I would like to honor a lovely guy called Half Bauer, who was based in Yorkshire. And he was an extraordinary filmmaker, and he spent all his life helping others to become filmmakers. And he just passed away last week. So someone like Half, I mean, changed my life basically. Because it took time to be able to to be with people and to say yes, there's something about you which will make you a filmmaker, and help you out. So all that experience basically meant that when I moved to Scotland in '99, and then very little was happening in Scotland. So all the years I was in Yorkshire, I was making films, but I was also teaching workshops. So for me, it was a natural fit to actually create something in order to carry on doing the teaching of documentary while making films. And another thing that I felt was missing in Scotland when I moved was, in a way, an international outlook in relation to documentary. I've always kind of, been involved with documentary, working with, colleagues in France, in Germany, in other places, Italy. So it was very odd for me to come to Scotland, and all of a sudden, the filmmakers here in Scotland were just working for BBC Scotland or STV, kind of, whenever they could get contracts, and that was it. So the setting up of Scottish Documentary Institute, and the reason why it's got such this grand label of being called kind of institute and carrying the word Scottish, was very much with the dream that somehow one day we will be known in the world for the documentaries that we are going to produce. And you've got to start somewhere. So the starting somewhere was bridging the gap. We thought, right, if we start a yearly scheme, we'll be able to tap on new talent, and we'll start from scratch, teaching people to use the skills, the filmmaking skills that they've already got, but with the idea that they would tell local stories, but for an international audience, i.e. using a cinematic language. So that's how Bridging the Gap started. And I very much remember that moment when I was talking to a colleague, filmmaker, Amy Hardy. We were driving back from some kind of screening in Glasgow. And that's when we said, yes, bridging the gap, filling that gap, kind of, that would be it. So that's how it kind of, appeared. So it's a very long answer, but it then makes sense in what we're trying to be doing with bridging the gap.
Yeah, thank you. And I think a really interesting, like some of the interesting developments that happened around Bridging the Gap was this kind of building of a community and building that kind of group of documentary filmmakers in Scotland. but with a worldwide outlook as well, because I think it's been very interesting for me personally when I kind of watched any Bridging the Gap films before joining SDI and while working at SDI as well, is that these this program is for Scotland-based filmmakers, but it doesn't necessarily have to be Scottish stories or based in Scotland. So they are kind of exploring the world in a way, and their backgrounds as well and where they're from. So yeah, maybe could you tell us a bit more about I don't know, the stories that you have, sparked your interest over the years, or the kind of um, yeah, um, history of Bridging the Gap, and what has been interesting for you in leading this program.
Well, I mean, I guess what's been interesting is always, I mean, every year we decide on a theme. So, this year it's kind of tomorrow. And we've had 19 themes kind of, over all those years. And every time people come up with something quite different, quite quirky as a take on that theme. And I like that. I like the kind of, that rebellious side of our filmmaker, say, no, I will push my story forward, but still trying to kind of mold it within the theme that we've put out. So for me, that's like a dialogue with the people out there, and making sure that it's not just us dictating what we are going to be doing, but it feels like a negotiation between what the filmmakers kind of suggest and what we are after. And I mean, some stories are just kind of, amazing. And yeah, it's just discovering different parts of the world which, we would not think about. I mean, one bridging the gap kind of, from a long time ago, for example, how to save a fish from drowning, which was actually shot in Montana because the filmmaker was from Montana. And it's a very simple story. It was on the theme of white. And of course, she went out there and filmed in winter, and it's kind of blanket white with snow and ice. So beautiful kind of landscape. And at the time, I felt, oh, I don't know, documentary about kind of, place in the States, the middle of nowhere, kind of, it didn't quite feel that it was that important. But at the time, it was kind of, when Bush kind of, was, President Bush was in power. And somehow the white kind of supremacy of the Americans was very much dominating the world politically. And then this story, which is a nobody story, where there's, a couple of guys, they go out on the frozen lake and fish. While fishing, we discover actually all the land around has been taken over, that beautiful kind of landscape been taken over in order to dig for oil. So you know that basically that community is dying. The fish, kind of, that they would normally fish already didn't exist. I mean, they were joking that sometimes they go and buy a fish to put it in the lake in order to bring it out. Perfect for climate change COP26 kind of, movie. And yet it was made kind of, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. And the humor of those white working class American guys completely undermined the arrogance that we were getting as an image from the States. And the fact that those guys, they basically sat there around that hole in a frozen lake, and they had nothing to do. The boredom of it was extraordinary. So it was like being in a Beckett kind of play. I mean, it was pure waiting for Godot in that moment. And for me, whenever something like this happens in a Bridging the Gap, I just get shivers with pleasure, because all of a sudden it's kind of transcending what we are trying to say. It's bringing pure poetry through the image, pure literature through the few silly jokes that people are kind of exchanging. It's beautiful and it's human, and every time I'm kind of thrown aback and say, wow, yeah, this is kind of good work that really deserves kind of to be shown off as this is Scottish work. So we've got many examples like this where the surprise of the story takes you back. Or another one, completely different. What's it called? Bumba, shot in Bulgaria. I can't remember the title now, starting with a B. Anyway, it was, again, the filmmaker was from Bulgaria, and he decided to make a film about his uncle. We used to be quite high up in the Communist Party, but of course, Bulgaria was going through the transition into capitalism and therefore a very different society. And he became like this lost sock, kind of, in the washing machine, this lost soul, where he couldn't let go of the past, where he had such a privileged life as member of the party Polizio. He was like, I don't know, he was talking about the parties and the champagne and the yachts, and I mean, as a lifestyle that you would not associate with Communist Party, basically. And his way of looking at the world now, of course, was completely transcending his own experience of what he lived as a young man. So that was fascinating, that clash of politics, someone being caught, frozen between two very different sets of society, and not knowing where he belonged, not knowing that actually he had to move forward, and therefore kind of remaining in that frozen state. And again, visually, it was shot in winter. It happens a lot because Bridging the Gap does start in winter, so we get a lot of wintry scenes. But that was kind of, really weird. I mean, this guy who didn't have a bathroom, he had a bath outside his house. And it was middle of winter with snow, and he was just going into that bath to kind of, to wash himself, and then kind of, running to kind of huddle his little kind of, stove where he was burning a bit of wood. So, visually, it's so rich, kind of, to be able to encounter those different characters and different aspects of societies that we assume we know, and then we discover that we don't actually.
Yeah, I remember watching mining poems or odes in the cinema at, I think it was Glasgow Short Film Festival, or somewhere in between other shorts. And I think it just stuck with me because I was just moving, I had just moved to Scotland at that point, and I was actually living in Govan without knowing much about the area, and just seeing that film about this man who had this love for poetry discovered while he was working in shipyards as a welder. That was really fascinating, and the way it was made and the way it was kind of transporting you in this world, it was really interesting. And just finding out about where I was living and having that kind of quality of just getting you to know more about the city, more about the people, and more about their story. That's really interesting. And I was wondering also about, you mentioned this kind of different ways of approaching stories and characters. I was also wondering about what different ways of making documentaries are there and creative ways of approaching documentary. I'm also thinking about the changes that happened in technology over the years and how that affected or helped spark creativity in the filmmakers that have come through the Bridge in the Gap program.
Yeah, I mean, the technology changed quite a lot, but actually not so much during the time of bridging the gap in the sense that already everyone was working with camcorders. So the quality kind of, increased. We went from, standard to kind of, to high definition. So from that point of view, it kind of, it just increased the quality. But we were already kind of working with kind of light technology. And the same with editing. I mean, we're already kind of editing with the programs that we've got. Of course, they kind of got better. I guess in the earlier days of bridging the gap, there was still some nostalgia about film. So some people were bringing in Super 8 quite a lot, and even shooting on Super 8. That seems to have gone a lot more, except now it's coming back through the creative use of archive. So from that point of view, we kind of going back there. But in terms of storytelling, I guess where I mean, we were lucky because of bridging the gap starting to happen when filmmakers understood the importance of sound and not just image. And that was a real transformation because before sound was just kind of recorded sync and mainly used as sync sound, and you try to get the best quality possible. But as people could hear sound better in cinemas, then it became obvious that sound could be used in a much more creative way and start being moved around and played around in order to be able to to create different layers kind of to the story. So that's been the big transformation for me, is the use of sound. And now it's kind of normal to have a sound designer to come on board and to work with the director.
Yeah, and I think um, for me it was also seeing animation in documentary that was really interesting, and exploring different hybrid formats in between, in this kind of connection between documentary and fiction. Um, and and also I was just thinking about one of our latest Bridging the Gap films about Born in Damascus that uses this kind of desktop
Yeah.
documentary style. So it's I think it's really interesting to explore all these different options, all these different techniques.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess in a way, limitations kind of always a great way of investing in new forms of kind of storytelling. So, Born in Damascus was very much the limitation of not being able to travel and go and see a cousin in Canada, and therefore remaining on Zoom, and very much creating a desktop feel to the entire film, between shared between kind of the archive footage and the footage of interviews and conversations kind of going on. So yeah, limitations are fantastic kind of for that, and really push everyone. Um, it also very much depends, if you're going for a very personal film, which is more kind of introvert, where you more visiting kind of the inside of the person, or if you're actually kind of observing someone, and therefore kind of filming in a very different way. But that's been the excitement in documentary in the last kind of 20 years, is in a way there's so many different ways of telling sometimes the same story. but just creating a different approach to it, depending on how you want to tell that story. And nothing like this has happened in fiction. Um, Frankly, I don't understand why people want to work in fiction. uh, I just don't get it. I mean, in my early days, I did some fiction and work with actors. I mean, the only thing is knowing that you're going to be filming such a day, such a place, and you've got everything and everyone organized. But beyond that, there's so little to discover there. In documentary, there's so many possibilities, so many things intervening. I'm sorry. That really it's just like a constant freedom to be able to to find a new way of telling a story which may have already been told by someone else. Of course, it's always different because it's always a different character, different situation. But if you're talking in terms of themes, I mean, they keep reoccurring. But every time you get that real fresh kind of, approach, because the director is finding her own way of telling that story and using different tools for doing it. I mean, we've got complete freedom now. We're not restricting ourselves like television is in terms of we've got to present the facts and we've got to make sure that everyone understands kind of, those facts. No, we're really storytelling, and therefore we've got complete freedom of approaching how we want what the story is.
Yeah, and I was thinking because having that freedom and having the courage to try out perhaps new things, that is something that I think needs a lot of confidence and needs a lot of trust and a lot of guidance as well. So I was wondering if you can talk a bit more about how bridging the gap helps in that way, how it kind of helps build confidence and explore different avenues.
Yeah, it's a fine line. On one hand, you need to give people confidence about what they are doing, but on the other hand, you've also got to nurture their rebellious side and give them a chance to discover doing something their own way. So walking that plank is quite tricky, but at Bridging the Gap, we have, when you select it and when you're developing your project, you've got different workshops you're attending, and we make sure that we bring different people into the workshops so they get different influences. And often the feedback is, oh my God, I'm so confused. Last month, kind of so and so said, do X, Y, and Z. This month, so and so is saying, do A, B, C. What shall I do? And in many ways, that confusion is meant to be there in order to get you to be questioned about how you think you want to do it, but also to make your decision on, no, this is really how I want to do. This is interesting, and I'm going to pinch some of that idea, but I'm going to take it this way because that's really how I want to have a go at doing it. And nothing gives me more pleasure than me saying to someone, it's not going to work, it's not going to work, and then it works. Oh, it's just so wonderful to be wrong. I love it. I love it. Try to make me wrong every time, please, because that's just fantastic. And but you need to do it in a gentle way in order for people to have that confidence to say, no, I'm really going to have a go and doing it that way. And it's very rare that we would say no, absolutely not, I mean, we always try to put ourselves on board on behalf of the filmmaker and on behalf of the film, because for us, I mean, the film really is very important. The filmmaker is important, but the film is also important because in a way the filmmaker is going to go on, carry on kind of, their lives and their careers. But the film will always carry Scottish Documentary Institute label on it and Bridging the Gap label. And we need that label to do something outside our little kind of world of Scotland in order to carry on kind of, the trust and the fame that those films have when we are distributing. And you know it better than anyone else, Alex, because you're doing it.
Yeah, it's been very interesting kind of when planning for the distribution of the films and reaching out to festivals that they already know and they have memories of Bridging the Gap film screening at their festivals, and even if they were 5 or 10 years ago. So that is really, it's a really good starting point for each film. And I think that's another one of the elements of the Bridging the Gap program that I think is helping support filmmakers and build that confidence that you have this kind of that we're offering this year of distribution in festivals, in international festivals, and each film has the opportunity to reach out to international audiences and local ones as well. So that's kind of the second half of of this program and the life of the film. Um, so
And
yeah.
of course, it's a calling card for
Mm.
any future work for that director. If I've already had a Bridging the Gap in that festival, then you can be sure that their first kind of, feature will get selected to the festival. And that's really, really important because it's really laying the foundation of a long-term relationship with festivals and with funders. I mean, our great, fantastic Creative Scotland, Screen Scotland, who has been funding Bridging the Gap and the activities around Bridging the Gap for the last kind of 19 years. In a way, it's there because it's an element of trust between them and us. Um, they trust us that we are going to be developing new talent, and they trust us that we're developing films which are going to carry the Scottish flag out there in the world, and therefore it benefits kind of everyone involved, the filmmakers, Scottish Documentary Institute, and Creative Scotland.
I believe quite a few of the films that were Bridging the Gap films, then so the filmmakers developed the story into feature-length documentaries um, or just kind of made feature-length documentaries afterwards. And the experience on Bridging the Gap was very useful in that sense. Um,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, we've got some great filmmakers now, who started with Bridging the Gap, and they're now kind of, flying in kind of, into the third, fourth kind of, feature documentaries or doing series for Netflix or whatever, kind of, but doing some great work out there, and still humble enough to recognize that cutting their teeth on Bridging the Gap was fundamental for them to be who they are as filmmakers. And that's always touching that somehow we're not just a scheme and people come and do it and then they forget about it. Somehow the voices of the mentors they encountered during their time at Bridging the Gap goes on kind of, talking in their heads forever and ever.
Yeah. I was wondering if we have any questions from you in the audience, if you're interested in applying this year, or if you have any thoughts on or any memories of Bridging the Gap as well.
And if you're not planning to apply, why? What's stopping you to apply? Anyone brave enough to come and talk to us? Gregor.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for everything you said. It's really interesting. I don't really have any experience of bridging the gap or SDI kind of prior to this. It's all very new. I was wondering, kind of in the application process in general, how important I guess your prior filmmaking work and the kind of stuff that you've made in the past, how important the kind of relevance of that is to the application, I suppose, and how important it is to link that in with your kind of the idea that you were pitching to SDI. I was wondering if you could talk anything about that.
Well, I guess I think the skills, the technical skills is important because we don't teach technical skills during the workshops. So that's one area that if you've got that acquired beforehand, it's better. And that's why we ask you to submit a previous kind of, short film, just so we can check out on the level of skills. It doesn't mean that you've got to be the best kind of technician. If your idea is strong, you're going to be selected, and you will have support from financial support in order for you to employ kind of cinematographer or sound recordist or editor to work with you. So in fact, even if you've got those skills, we encourage you to work with professionals, technicians, in order for you to actually raise your skills. Because if you're working with a professional editor, someone who's got a lot more experience than you, then not only it will facilitate you organizing, structuring your story, but you will be learning in the process, and that daily contact with an editor for a period where we will be coming in and questioning you and say, no, that doesn't work, etc. So all that is part of the experience of being on Bridging the Gap. So at this stage, really, just kind of show us kind of, what level you are. And this is not kind of, to judge you, but just to know what we are dealing with. And then try to very much kind of develop the story that you want to tell. And at the end of the day, that is more the make and break kind of, if you've got an interesting story and if you've got an interesting way of telling that story, even if you don't have the skills to do it, then it would be of interest to us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Answer your question, Gregor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you. It was a sort of vague question, but that's exactly what I was kind of trying to mean. So thank you.
I mean, what's your background, Gregor?
My personal background is I've made one documentary before ever. It's doing festivals at the moment, and I kind of worked in corporate for many years, and so my experience doing actual, real documentaries, not corporate documentaries, is fairly minimal. But I generally in my kind of personal work, I always work alone, really, just out of necessity. So when I've worked with crews on stuff before, it's been, or everything I've ever shot, I've edited myself, and whenever I've worked with crews, it's been like maximum 3 people. So it's my experience has been very much sort of DIY.
Yeah. Well, sounds like you're a perfect candidate for Bridging the Gap, because what you would have is a lot of bad habits, kind of, working for corporate.
Yes,
and
for
we'll
sure.
basically be pointing those out to you, saying, no, that doesn't work for storytelling, etc. Because making films for corporate, nothing wrong with that. But it's very much kind of message driven. You've got to say very quickly what it is about. What you are not doing is creating an experience for people to live, to think through the story that you are saying. So that's a big difference. And people who work constantly kind of in the corporate world, they forget about if you share a story, if you live through it, if emotionally you can link your audience to it, people will remember it. People will think about it in a different way. But so that's kind of, what you would be doing during Bridging the Gap, is being reminded that you've got to bring emotion into your stories in order for people to remember it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions or any other potential applicants?
I have a question.
Yes, Erika.
Hi, Noe. Let me get my video to work. Does that work? Hi. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about your experience, like with people doing kind of more like essay films, if that has been a possibility, or people who are kind of exploring maybe a subject more than a character, and kind of how they approached that in terms of story and application and things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, essay films are very, very much kind of, part of Bridging the Gap. I mean, we've got many different examples, kind of, of essay films. They're much harder to kind of, to do, and they tend to be very personal also, of course. But done well, they're so beautiful, and they really kind of stay with you. And therefore, it's, what we'll say, yeah, that would be a good Bridging the Gap.
Cool. Do you have any examples of some? Maybe I could look up prior.
Well, I mean, I was Alex has kind of, mentioned the poem. Alex, help me with the title.
Mining Poems.
Mining Poems. Mining Poems is an interesting one because for me it's very much an essay film. Then I would say Chico's film about a Filipino in the sea. Trying to get the title. Sorry, I'm kind of my head is full of titles and names and can never recall them. That's my great weakness in life. Alex, so Chico, who did Don Quixote as a feature, is Bridging the Gap was...
Anyway. I'll look it up. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. And that was that it was, although it was kind of observational, it had very much of an essay feel to it, because he wasn't really observing someone doing something, but he was observing someone being someone in a way. And that shifted it into the essay type of film rather than observational film. I'll find a few more and kind of email them to you.
That'd be great, thank you.
Polaris, I think, was the film.
Polaris,
yeah.
Yes. I think you must have seen it, Erika.
I think so. It rings a bell. Yeah, a couple of years, maybe first semester or something. But yeah, that sounds good.
I think we probably kind of it's a very good example of a turning point. What is a turning point in a film? And
okay.
Here we are at sea for most of the film, but we've got that phone call of this Filipino sailor to his wife. And that's kind of an amazing turning point, because all of a sudden we really feel for him. He's been at sea for months. He can't even remember how many months his wife is pregnant, because he's been so lost kind of in time. And it's that moment of not wanting to hang up the phone, because it's such precious little minutes of hearing his wife's voice, which might not happen again for several months. I mean, it's just a beautiful moment. That's technically the only sync moment in the film, because every other sound is kind of part of what's happening. But yeah, so that is a beautiful SF film for me.
Well, I'll check that out. Thank you. That's very helpful.
What about Mei-Ling? I'm going to dig you out behind your name, Mei-Ling.
Yeah, I'm just figuring out how I can turn on the video.
Oh well, if you can't, don't worry. Just talk to us.
Yeah. I mean, thank you very much for sharing the very enlightening things about the documentary. I was very impressed by the what you said, the difference between documentary and fiction. You said documentary is something that you can explore more possibility, and it is given more freedom to let you see the world. And fiction is something like you film in an organized way and everything is arranged. But does that mean that you give the fiction its full negation? Because as I know, like some of the fiction, they also tend to explore the director's inner world, that like they're very in-depth thinking, and it's also very emotional that can attract the audience eyes. Like what I know, one of them is called CO Angela Close, like Whipping Meadow. It's really amazing. And well, this one is like it's created in a, I think it's more documentary way. So I just want to know, like what's the real difference between this, what you say, documentary, and this fiction that I mentioned. Thank you.
I was being very cheeky, Mei-Ling, and provocative. Of course, there are some beautiful fiction, and I'm a sucker kind of, for good fiction. What I was trying to say is fiction has lived through a bit of a crisis, and I think partly because of Hollywood, really. Hollywood has so utterly defined how to tell a story with actors that it has left very, very little space for new filmmakers to come and do it kind of differently. But of course, some do, and it's happening. And interestingly enough, it's actually happening more outside what I would say kind of mainstream cultures, such as the States, or such as kind of Europe. If you're as old as myself, I mean, you would remember kind of the French wave, you would remember the kind of Italian cinema, etc. I mean, you had all sorts of different waves of telling stories and extraordinary directors in fiction. Yes. But somehow all that kind of, started evaporating and disappearing. And it's real shame, because it is really important to have kind of good fiction. So while fiction was experimenting this I would say ossification of how to tell a story, documentary became the opposite. And it's interesting, someone like Herzog, who's very much a fiction director, and told and made crazy kind of films as a fiction director, really got sucked into documentary and became an extraordinary documentary director. So it's fascinating how that language between documentary filmmaking and fiction filmmaking is evolving. And of course, we can
yes, I just found it.
And I think documentary filmmaking enriched itself by using tools from the fiction world. And by taking kind of, by freeing itself from so-called objectivity, which was the chuckles of documentary, by breaking those off and by using tools that normally are used in fiction, then we enrich the documentary language to tell stories with reality.
Yeah.
And I think both will evolve kind of, in different ways. And right now, for example, kind of, especially coming from Asia, we've got some fascinating fiction, appearing on our screens. Yeah, I think it's kind of exciting time for cinema.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we are approaching the end of the coffee morning today, but if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to jump in. Yes, Gregor?
I just had one more actually. I thought of apologies if this one goes off on too much of a tangent, but it was just something that I've had a lot of discussions with people about, and especially in line with kind of the other film that I've done, is the kind of the presence of a kind of sort of an author's voice in a film, in a documentary film, especially like a short documentary film, and the idea of there being a specific moral or kind of narrative message that comes as a result of it. You're a kind of the author's presence, I suppose, in the piece. I mean, how important do you think that is to be there versus trying to show, I know you talked about kind of objectivity, but trying to show a story as relatively objectively as possible, and without too much kind of implicit commentary on that from kind of your point of view?
I really don't believe in being objective. Being objective for me, it's kind of, you're not taking any responsibility for what you are saying or for your film. You're just hiding behind other people. In creative documentary, it's really important that you move people to think differently. You're not changing people. I don't believe in film changing the world, but I truly believe in film allowing people a space and an opportunity to think differently about the world. So if you've got any message at all to pass through your film, it's really for people to kind of work it out and to all of a sudden say, oh my God, I didn't think about this way, or I didn't know about this way. So we are creating moments in order for the audience to think and reflect in a different way. That's what we are doing. We are not saying this is what it is, this is kind of how it should be, etc. Even if you have people saying that in the film, but it's not you, the filmmaker, and it's not you directing it in that direction. It's really questioning our reality and trying to make us think differently about the reality, but not dictating how it should be. Hopefully, of course, I will think the same way as I do, but that's not the point.
Thank you. I guess maybe kind of objectivity was maybe the wrong word to use there, but I suppose my question was maybe more about attempting to convince your audience of a particular viewpoint, or trying to get them to think in a particular way, versus presenting them with a variety of different ideas and hoping that they will draw their own conclusions and maybe not all come out of the documentary feeling the same way, if that makes sense. Wanting to your audience to kind of to convince them of a specific viewpoint or a specific idea versus presenting many different cases on the same kind of topic, and allowing people to kind of have conversations about it and not necessarily all feel like the one answer that the person, say, gives in the film is the correct answer.
I think we are, because we live in a digital world, in a social media world, we are so confused about so many different positions. That feeling of being overwhelmed, it's probably what most people feel when someone is trying to convince you. It's like, when you're going you know, you to vote, and you've got also different parties kind of, you know, lined up outside the voting door, kind of saying, yeah, this and that argument, and kind of, you know, kind of, you know, please, kind of, you know, what we need is space to reflect. And that's really what's missing in our lives and in our kind of digital world. The documentary offers that space. Every second of your film counts towards contributing to that space. It's not saying, oh, well, okay, I've presented A, B, and C, now you decide kind of what you think. No, we kind of, you know, the motivation of the filmmaker, the director, is really important here, because it's your motivation as a director which is going to guide us through how you working out that way of thinking, and then leaving it open for people to decide, yeah, that kind of, you know, makes sense to me, that connects with my reality or not, or etc. It's really interesting, actually. I've just looked at a rough cut of a film being made about oil, and it's literally the entire film is kind of, you know, interview driven. And you've got, you know, people for and against, kind of, you know, the need for oil, etc. And at the end of the film, I could barely kind of, you know, remember what the arguments were, because every person, even the ones that I did not agree with, put such a good case, kind of, you know, in the sense, you know, their normality, kind of, you know, in the way they're presenting things, next to someone else's kind of normality or their way of presenting things, meant that at the end of the film, I, you know, just say, oh, okay, so there are all those diverse opinions, but I wasn't kind of moved to say, oh, I better change my way of life, or it's really important for me to, you know, to think about this differently. All I was faced with was, oh, there are all those different possibilities of thinking about this this problem, and you know, it's like looking through kind of a little kaleidoscope, and everything is kind of fragmented, but all looks the same at the end, and yet they're not. So it's very important for the director to be able to go beyond that impression and start making the audience feel and think differently.
Brilliant, thank you so much.
And one rule which always works in documentaries: less is more. The less you say, the less you do, the more impact you have. So on less is more.
Yeah.
We
Thank
better
you.
move on to another meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much, Noe, and thank you everyone for attending and for your questions and comments. If you do want to apply for the Bridging the Gap under the theme tomorrow, you can still do until Sunday, the 26th of September. And you can, on our website, you can find more information, the full guidelines, and even more clips helping you through those guidelines and the application process. So yeah, I hope to see your projects and to hear more from you and your work. And thank you very much, Noe, for taking us through the history of Bridging the Gap and all these different things to think about when exploring documentary filmmaking. So yeah, thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.